T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis on a mission to build, resupply, and to do research on the International Space Station.
Houston now controlling. Atlantis begins its penultimate journey to shore up the International Space Station. Atlantis now on the proper alignment for its 8.5-minute ride to orbit. 4.5 million pounds of hardware and humans taking aim on the International Outpost. 30 seconds into the flight. Atlantis almost 2 miles in altitude, almost 6 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center already, traveling 500 miles an hour. The 3 liquid fuel main engines now throttling back to 72% of rated performance, going into the bucket, reducing the stress on the shuttle as it breaks through the sound barrier.
Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be here talking to you today. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what got me inspired to become an astronaut, because it goes back to when I was really young. I guess I was around year 5, year 6 primary school. I was really interested in space. We had some topics on space at school. I have this memory of an astronaut visiting my school, but it might just be, one of those memories, because I've never been able to work out who it was and why they were at my school. But I really do have this memory in mind from a couple of years earlier. And yeah, we were learning about black holes, and so that just kind of got me fascinated. And then a few years later, when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to go to some museums in the US through one of my school programs. And so I went to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and I went to the Kennedy Space Center. I did a simulation driving the space shuttle. I was supposed to be landing it, but I wasn't very good at it. I in fact very, very bad at it. But time helps these things out. But at the time in Australia, there was no space agency. So even though I thought being an astronaut could be like the coolest job in the world, I never thought it was something that I could actually do. So I kind of had it at the back of my mind, and I just continued with doing science subjects, which what I enjoyed. Maths I enjoyed in particular, and languages too. So I kind of continued along that path, not knowing exactly what was going to happen. And then later on, after I'd finished all my university studies, I moved to Italy. And during that time, I had the opportunity to do what's called a winter over, so a year of research in Antarctica. And in Antarctica, at this particular station called Concordia Station, it's also called White Mars because the people there are so isolated and are at a high altitude. So it's a bit like going on a mission to Mars. And so the European Space Agency does tests on the people that are there. And so I learned a lot more about the European Space Agency. And about that time, I started to hear rumors that they were going to be opening up applications for astronauts for the first time since 2008. And this was in 2019. And so finally in 2021, they did open these applications. And at that point, that was just something I absolutely, definitely wanted to try. So that's why I applied. So while I was at school, I did a lot of extracurricular activities because I really love to get involved in things. I kind of liked not having so many things that I was doing that made me kind of structure my time quite well. Um, so, but in my biggest one was called future problem solving, which is not just for STEM, but it certainly helps in that kind of problem solving mindset. And so, yeah, I participated in that from when I was in year 6 all the way through to year 12. And in fact, I'm still participating in it now as an evaluator. So on Wednesday, in fact, I'm heading off to the United States to evaluate the international competition. So it's something I've been involved in for all my life practically. And it's something that, like I said, it really gets you in that problem solving mind frame, which is great for engineering, for science, but in fact, for any kind of walk of life. So that was a really, really big one. That's an interesting question. I don't know if I have a favorite female scientist. Um, I've come into contact with many scientists over my time, and I always sort of say that I look up most to the people that I actually know, because then you don't just see them kind of one dimensionally or two dimensionally. You see them as a whole person, and you see, if you really get to know them, you can talk to them about their journey. So I think, in answer to this question, I would say my colleagues, and at the National Research Council of Italy, where I work, I have actually quite a lot of female colleagues, and most of them are physicists, which is quite unusual. Still, unfortunately, it's still unusual for women to be physicists in Italy, but it's growing, and that's great. So I really look up to them because they're people that I know. I've seen their journeys, and also as I go to conferences, doing scientific conferences, I come into contact with some really interesting people. So I wouldn't say that there is one particular famous scientist that I particularly look up to or am inspired by, but I'm inspired every time I speak to a female scientist. Well, early on, I didn't have any particular role models, astronauts, for example. At the time, there were very, very few women when I was young, I mean. There were very, very few female astronauts, and it wasn't something that like I said, it wasn't something that I really considered. Um, but I looked up to all the women in my life. I'm lucky enough to have 4 sisters, and I had an amazing mother who brought us all up, and so I really, really looked up to all of my family. But I think more recently, as I've been on this journey of the selections to become an astronaut, I've been particularly inspired by Samantha Cristoforetti, who's an Italian astronaut. She was the first, well, she was the only woman who was selected in the 2008 round of selections out of the 7 people that were selected. So I've looked up to her, and she's a really amazing all-round person. You see her in interviews, and she's really well spoken, and she knows a lot about many different things, but at the same time is humble. And I've had the opportunity to meet her now, and she's like that in person too. I think I suppose I've had many pieces of advice over the years, and some of them have been good, and some of them have been bad. Um, but again, I wanna highlight my mom again in this one, and it's a fairly cliche thing to be told, but it's really what I've stood for all these many years is never give up. There are things that may set you back, but you just got to keep trying. So I would say never give up. I think one of my favorite memories would probably go back to my time in Antarctica. So I was there, like I said, for a whole year, and I was in these really extreme conditions. So at Concordia Station, we got down to the lowest temperature we had was minus 104 degrees Celsius with the wind chill. So it was very, very cold. And just these extreme conditions, the fact that we were in altitude meant that it was even difficult to breathe because it was at 3,200 meters, but at our sort of latitudes, that's more like being at 4,000 meters because the air is thinner at the poles. So just to say that it was quite difficult conditions to be in. And every week, a colleague and I would have to go walk 1 kilometer away from the base, dig out the snow that had accumulated on top of this shelter under the snow, get out our harnesses, put them on, and climb up a 45-meter tower to clean all the instruments that were on there. So it was a fairly tough task. And, you know, when leading up to it throughout the week, you go, oh no, I have to do that. I have to do that later this week. I have to do this tomorrow. I have to do that this afternoon. So it's one of those things where you're kind of not looking forward to it, but then you start, and it turns out to be one of the best parts, because what we would do is we would turn off our headlamps as we were walking there. And that meant that our eyes slowly adjusted and we could see the stars. And there in Antarctica, it's like you're inside the stars. They're just completely surrounding you. The shooting stars I saw were absolutely amazing. And yeah, it was just beautiful. And it's kind of a very moving experience. And of course, when you're there, you think about being in the stars, and at that point I was already thinking about applying to become an astronaut, so it was a very special memory for me. So before the selections, there wasn't a huge amount of information about what the testing was going to be. We had kind of these generic names for each of the phases, and just to go through them quickly, there were 6 phases. So the first one was a screening based on our CVs and motivation letters and our answers to a questionnaire. So that was 23,000 people that went through that phase. But from there, that was probably the hardest phase to get through, because they had to cut it down to only 1,300 people who could go through to the next phase. So in a way, I was dreading that one, and I was waiting for a really long time to get my answer. From there, I didn't really know what to expect, except in the next round, because the former British astronaut Tim Peake had written a book about when he did the selections process, and it actually turned out to be quite similar. So I joined a Discord server with a bunch of other aspiring astronauts, and we talked about what could possibly come up during these tests, and we found out that there was a website called Pilot Test, which had some similar exercises to the ones that were in Tim Peake's book, so we thought that was a good way to practice. And so I spent quite some time practicing on that website. And so I kind of learned what was coming up in that step. And they were computer-based testing. And yes, one of these was with a joystick, but I didn't mind that one too much. It was a bit tricky. You kind of had to, it was kind of a multitasking test. So you had to be manipulating a joystick to kind of follow something around at the same time. Yeah, that's right. So that one was there were a couple of ones with a joystick. So the multitasking test was it was like you were flying a plane. So you had to keep up your altitude and latitude and so on. At the same time, they were giving you a string of numbers, and you had to click a certain number when it was odd and another one when it was even. And there was something about colors as well. So there were a lot of things going on, and it was difficult, but that wasn't actually the one that I was dreading, I would say. The one that I was dreading was called RMS, something about memory sequence. I'm already losing my memory of it. probably blocking it out because it was a really tough test. Basically, they would read a series of numbers, and you didn't know how many numbers these were gonna be. Numbers between 1 and 9, and they would just read them out, up to about 30 of them, I would say, but they would stop at a random moment. And then at that point, you had to remember type in the numbers backwards. So starting with the last number, going to the second last, third last, and so on, to as many as you could remember. Which was really, really difficult. And the first moment in which you made a mistake, that was the points you got. So if you made a mistake on the second number, then you only got 1 point. If you made a mistake on the fifth number, then you got 4 points, even if you got the rest of the numbers correct. So yeah, that was probably the one I was dreading, because it was something that I knew that was going to be in there. And then the other tests in that one were maths and physics and English and some kind of logic tests and more memory tests, quite a lot of memory tests. And then from there was the third round, which was the psychological round. And I don't think I was dreading anything there because it's just, I mean, it is what it is. You answer how you can, you have to be honest. And so we had some talks with individually with psychologists and a panel with psychologists. We had some group exercises and some pair exercises, and there were about 400 people doing that round, but we all had our own day, so there were only about 8 people each day. And then from there was the medical testing. There were only about 100 people at that point, and I guess I was both dreading and looking forward to this phase because it's a kind of, you could kind of get a consolation prize, right? They tested absolutely everything, so they really tested how healthy we are, and it meant that I got all this testing for free, I guess. And so even if I didn't get through, then they would have found perhaps something important for my health that I could do something about. So that's kind of a consolation prize in a way. And I was glad I got the opportunity to do that. Fortunately, there was nothing wrong, and I was able to get through to the next round, which was a panel interview. And I think that was probably the toughest of the entire process, to be honest. I wasn't expecting it to be, but yeah, it turned out they asked some really tough questions, kind of hypothetical questions about what would things that might happen on the International Space Station, but also questions that we might get from journalists, from the general public. And yeah, so that was really tough. But then what actually turned out to be kind of one of the nicest parts was the final interview with the Director General, because that was just like having a conversation. He was just interested in getting to know us. And yeah, so that was really nice. But I think the best part about the whole process was the fact that we were in fairly small groups each time. The first time was about 25 people, but from then on, they were always groups of sort of 6 to 8 or even fewer. And so you would get to know these other people who were applying to be astronauts and get to know their backgrounds and what they were doing. And there were a lot of pilots, there were a lot of scientists, doctors. So it was really interesting to get to know all these people. I think during my PhD, when I was doing my PhD studies, there were definitely moments where it was tough. And I was the first student, the first PhD student that my supervisor had. So I didn't have a group around me until it sort of built up during the years. And so I had a lot of pressure from my supervisor, and there were moments then when that was too much pressure. And there were some things that just kind of unfortunately, even today, there are kind of some comments that female scientists might get, just like, oh, women are try to do too many things, and it means that they're not able to focus on one thing. This in particular because I decided to take a semester, the second semester of my PhD, off to run a volunteer program. And so, I mean, some people weren't happy with that. It turned out to be a really great decision, but so just kind of balancing the pressures of meeting this particular goal, at the same time as wanting to be a well-rounded person. So there were some moments in there where I'm like, why am I doing this PhD? Should I have made a different choice? But I wouldn't say that I actually ever got close to giving up, because like my mom said, never give up. So it's never been something that's never been part of me to give up on something. Choose to stop doing something because I don't like it, and it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. Sure. But something that I have a goal about and want to continue with, but I don't think it's necessarily always giving up. You might make a different choice, and it's a choice that's good for you. So it really depends on your definition of giving up. But I think in this case, like, I would have felt that had I stopped doing my PhD, that would have been giving up in my case, because it was a goal that I wanted to work towards. In general, working in a male-dominated industry, I guess the first time I kind of had any inkling of that, I mean, no, it's true. I knew about this kind of thing at school, but it wasn't until year 12, I guess, when I was actually in a completely male-dominated class. I did Extension 2 maths, and I was the only girl in that whole class. And that just made me even more determined to beat all the boys, which I did. So, yeah, and then I kind of I enjoyed it. You get used to it. So then I did a Bachelor of Engineering, and again so it was on the chemical engineering side. So that tends to have more women, but it's still a very low proportion of women. And yeah, you get really close to the other women who are in the course, but also to the men. And I think nowadays, at least from my perspective, it kind of felt normal. I didn't feel like the odd one out. And there have only been those small occasions when somebody says something that just doesn't, it's just not right, that's something old-fashioned perhaps, that come up. And generally in my career, I've been lucky enough not to have too many problems. I haven't come across too many situations like that where women, and in particular myself, have been discriminated against. So I'm glad to say that it's improving a lot. I think I'll go back to the story I was saying about my PhD. So um, during that first semester, I was kind of didn't know exactly where I was going with the PhD, and I was also going through a bad breakup at the time, so it was a bit of a tough time. And at the same time, I wanted to run this volunteer program. It was the Orientation Week program, Yellow Shirts program at the University of New South Wales, because it was a program that I had been doing every year. And then at this point, I decided to apply to be the coordinator. And I think it was really important for me to have that time off, because I hadn't had any time off between my Bachelor of Engineering and my PhD, between my honours and my PhD. So I kind of went straight into the PhD, and it would have been good to have some time to kind of work things out a bit better. So instead, I did that during my second semester when I decided to run this volunteer program, and I think that was a really important thing for my well-being, and it meant that I could reset when I went back into it later, after another semester. So yeah, it was tough. It was particularly tough because, like I said, I was my supervisor's only PhD student. And so he didn't like the fact that I was going away, and he thought that I might not come back. So it was tough to tell him that. But it was an important thing for me to do, not just because of this kind of needing a bit of time off, but also because I was so passionate about this program and I really felt that I wanted to do this thing. So yeah, that was one time when I had to kind of prioritize myself. Another time was when I went to Antarctica. So my background is in engineering, materials science, chemistry, that kind of thing. So it doesn't really fit in with the research that is done in Antarctica. But I saw this advertisement come up, and it was within the National Research Council of Italy, so it was still within the same main institution, but it wasn't in my particular institute. So it meant that I had to basically quit my job and take a new one, quit my contract and take a new one with a different institute within the same umbrella institution. So my supervisor was not at all happy with that. Again, I had been working there for about 5 years by then. But in this case, he wasn't happy, but he was extremely supportive. But it was another difficult conversation to have because of that, because he was so supportive, and he didn't necessarily understand why I would want to go and do this. And that made it a difficult thing to tell him. And then I went back again another year later. That time I got to keep my contract. We worked it out. But again, I was going for 3 months that time, and it was at an important kind of transition period at work. And so he wasn't entirely happy with it. But again, he was extremely supportive. So the conversation was difficult to have. But in that case, I had a lot of support around me, and obviously, it was also difficult to talk about it with my husband, because I was leaving him at home the first time for a year and the second time for 3 months, without me there. So there were difficult conversations, but fortunately, in that case, I had some really supportive people around me. Yeah, I think at this stage in your life, the important thing to know is that yes, you're making some choices, but they're not the end of the world, right? So just do what is interesting to you now, and you never know where you might end up. Just because there are so many different opportunities that come up along the way. So don't feel like what you're choosing now is setting in stone what your future career is going to be. Don't put that pressure on yourself. Yes, it's important to do things that you love. It's important to consider what your future is going to be, because the important thing to do is to pursue everything to your best capacity. And if you do well in things, then they will bring you new opportunities to do other things. But don't feel like it's the be all and end all, because there are opportunities to change in the future. For now, have a look at what you really enjoy doing and follow that kind of thing. So I enjoy doing maths and science and languages. So that's what I decided to do for my later years at school. From then, I kind of looked at my different options for university, and I knew that I wanted to do something in the sciences. And then I ended up in engineering, which I'm really, really happy with, because it meant that I could do a bit more maths, which I really enjoyed. It wasn't something that I'd actually considered before I saw the co-op program, which is a scholarship at the University of New South Wales, which allows you to do some industrial training placements, and that's kind of what attracted me to it. But apart from that, I wasn't considering engineering because, well, it was the early 2000s, and even then, women, for girls didn't necessarily see that engineering could be a career path for them. So even then, in the early 2000s, so it wasn't something that I was necessarily considering. But then I saw this program and it looked really interesting. I managed to get the scholarship for it, and that played a lot into my choice, just getting that scholarship. But there would have been some other courses that I would have loved just as much, I'm sure. Would have taken me perhaps down a slightly different path, but who knows? I might well have ended up exactly where I am now, because of different sort of opportunities that came up along the way. So that's all to say that don't feel too much pressure now. Go with what you love and look out for along the way just random opportunities that might come up, like in my case, Antarctica, because that is what really pushed me towards becoming an astronaut in the end, which again is not something that you would necessarily do as a scientist, but the opportunity came my way and I worked for it. Well, actually, so you will have heard probably of the Artemis program, which is Artemis is the sister of Apollo. So this is us going back to the moon, but it's not just about humans going back to the moon to put their feet on the moon again. And in particular, for a woman to go to the moon for the first time and somebody non-American to go for the first time. No, this is about going to the moon and staying there. So it's not completely out of the question to colonize. In this case, it's more kind of what we have in Antarctica, which is not a colony because it's not people who are living there to live there. They're people who are living there to do research. So you can think about it more in that way. So we'll put some scientific bases on the moon and there will be people living there, but not necessarily to colonize it. Now, I don't know what that will happen down the track with Mars as well, many years down the track, but it will happen eventually too. In terms of actually having a colony of people there, well, I don't know. The technology is not available at the moment, but who knows in the future.